Hello, how goes it, guys? How goes it? Have we decided what we want to do? Do we watch this crime show that Nando's linked? Let's see if we like it. See if I'm vibing.
In Austria, for over 20 years, a
there we
person
go,
in
guys.
Austria kept a horrible secret. And in 2008, that secret was inadvertently revealed and it shocked the world. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious...
Why does he remind me of Carol Baskin? Killer husband whacked
times every week. So if that's of interest to you, invite the like button to come over to your house for a family dinner party and then proceed to serve them a severely oversalted dish. But before they take a bite, be sure to tell them you're so proud of your cooking and you can't wait to get their feedback. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Yeah, I can upload.
Right, let's get into today's story.
Hello, no proper up. It was quick. Tell ya, don't mess around. I don't believe that for a second.
On August 28th, 1984, an 18-year-old girl.
No worries,
named
Angel.
Elizabeth
No worries
went
at
missing.
all.
On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them,
nice handwriting.
and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before.
Never join a cult, guys.
After the parents left the police
Lessons
station,
with Dakara.
the police began conducting
Avoid
interviews
cults.
with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well-liked and respected in town. And Rose Marie had gotten married
Thank you for your follow as well, look.
17,
Thank you so much. You seem really sweet.
By
You're
all
more than
accounts,
welcome
from the
here.
outside looking
Thank
in,
you.
they were a very ordinary family. But as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history,
you want to steer clear of these cults, guys.
Behind closed doors. Despite his friendly outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by.
Why would you not push that further? I don't understand.
From Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event.
I did get my shot. I have my sticker to prove it. Thank you, Ashley.
On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten.
223
Her
subs.
skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, But after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say,
red flag right there.
But it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life.
Why would he not want to? Yeah.
And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decide to get the police involved.
Grandfather.
There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl,
well, I
Elizabeth.
recognize that
The police
guy's
asked
face.
Joseph, what's going on here? And he tells them that earlier that day,
I've seen a similar documentary on
Netflix was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, this girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick, and I can't take care of her. Can you and Mom take her to the hospital? While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media, and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, we need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life. And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like
stay tuned, Derry. I'm not going to spoil anything.
Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively? And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in 2 separate rooms to be interviewed.
I love when they do that.
Elizabeth. And initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. Then for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually, Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again. When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened. After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands. She took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only 1 door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door, and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for
He built his own prison.
To get into the shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into
building
keypad,
your own
he could
prison
open that
is
secret
dope.
door, and it would reveal this
Not
secret
gonna lie,
underground
Mick
prison
love
that was
him.
basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through this secret door and actually entered into this
if
prison,
he was just building
you would
this
start
to
by
like
entering
hide
this
his own
soundproof
treasures
narrow
or
hallway
something,
that went
fair
on for several
play.
feet before
But for
it
some
entered into
sick,
this very small
twisted
bathroom
game
area
like this,
where the
I
bathroom
just
was
can't bear
unbelievably
it.
cramped, and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow, and at the end of that hallway it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small
The amount
that
of
it barely
thought
contained
that he
the
must have
one
put
bed
into
that was inside
this.
of it. And then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick reinforced concrete. That combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison meant
Imagine
no one could hear
screaming and
Elizabeth's
just
cries for
no
help.
one being
Also,
able
the
to hear,
inside of
and
the
you're
prison
so
was
close
heavily
to home.
monitored by Joseph's security system. So truly, Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy. She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone.
5
Her
years.
only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child.
There we
She
go,
was
Derry, there's your
terrified of the
answer.
pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing.
Yeah, obviously.
And so he gave her a book about
He's not
childbirth,
gonna want
and
that.
he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord.
Oh,
and said,
this
"Good luck."
is a
And so
sick
on August
man.
30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the
Knowing
birth of
full
Kirsten,
well that could have
Elizabeth
killed
would
her as
deliver
well.
6 more of her father's children.
6!
All the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms.
Chinese.
And after the baby died, Joseph
That's
took
so
the body,
sad.
threw it in a stove,
N-word,
and
thank you
incinerated
for
it
your
like it was
follow.
nothing. In the late 90s, the
What I'm
6
watching
living
is just so
children down
sad
in the
right
basement
now.
were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply.
You know what's terrifying? Like, his threats do have so much weight because he could easily do that. He could have easily gassed them all out down there, killed them all, and no one's ever going to know because they don't know that they've even been born. Sick, man.
For multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to.
Yeah.
And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight, and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home,
Yeah, his
he put on
own
this elaborate
darling.
charade about how he had discovered
And then
this
impregnated
baby on
her
the front
6
step,
times.
and that there was a note attached to the baby, and
Killed
it was
his
from Elizabeth,
own
his daughter,
grandson.
and this child was apparently Elizabeth's,
Tanya
and she
Lufa,
took
thank you
care
so
of it,
much for your
and she was
follow.
leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their
Currently
own.
watching
And
a
Joseph
crime
had actually
show.
made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it.
It is no
years,
problem, Rob, it
Joseph
is.
would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these
Never
kids
gonna
in,
let you
and she
down.
and Joseph
Never
raised
gonna
them as
give
their
you
own.
up.
Eventually, when these
Gonna
3
let
kids
you
got
down.
old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth,
No, his wife didn't
was
know.
low-life, and she had
His wife
abandoned
just thought he
them,
was
and she
going
didn't
down
care
in his
about
basement to
them.
work.
And in reality, their
Your
mother and
freckles
their
have
other
you-
3 siblings,
my
they
freckles are
didn't know
really bad
existed,
because I've been in the
were
sun
locked
so
up
much.
in the basement below their feet.
Hey,
Initially,
thank you so
investigators
much.
believed all of these children
you.
Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got
Thank
out
you
of
so
the
much,
prison,
Raj, for your follow.
no man would
Appreciate
want her.
it.
She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her, that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they
This
would get to
makes me so
experience it for
sad
real.
that those
Finally, in
children's
2008,
lives started
so
that
24
way.
years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police
Look at
found
his
out
face.
about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs
Things
and
of
they used the
nightmares.
codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement, because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those 2 kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other 3 siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And
Not
vitamin
surprised.
D you
I mean, I
primarily
suffer
get
from that,
the
and I'm not
sun,
locked in a
and in her
basement.
19 years
Just locked
of
in the
life,
office?
she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know
Ashley
what was
is
going
asking
on
the same
in her
thing.
basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemary, and they investigated her and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared.
Isn't there a movie
It's also
about a
worth
case like
noting
this?
that
Yes,
in those
Lynn.
24
Yes, there
years
is.
that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the
He
basement,
looks like Albert
Joseph had
Einstein.
over 100 people
Don't
rent
insult
out a
Albert
room
that way.
inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However,
do you think that they could actually survive something like that?
The family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives.
Really,
As for
though?
Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most
I hope
hated
that's the
people in
case.
his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And
Oh,
so
what a
now
shame.
prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed, and so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement.
Is that a
He
bad
will
thing?
be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's
He's going to be
episode,
89
let us
and
know in the
paroled.
comments what
That
it is
makes me
and
feel
where you
sick.
found it, so give us the timestamp.
He should not be paroled ever. He should be on death row, right? Thoughts, guys? Thoughts on that? So yeah, they're apparently leading like semi-normal lives. But if you've experienced that and you've gone through that in your life, the PTSD surely would be overwhelming. And when you're talking to friends or family, it's gonna be hard. Like the one that always sticks in my mind is the Fred and Rose West situation. Shituation right there. Because they're poor kids, and yes, they have families and stuff now, but they're affected by what they went through. And you can change your name, you can change your ID and where you live, your location. You can be whoever you want to be, but that's still up there. That's still up there what you went through. They're incredible. I'm in awe of the people that go through events as serious as that and get out the other side. Like, hats off to you, you know. Are we up for watching more true crime stuff? I recommend looking at the face of Henrietta Lacks. You might enjoy it. Henrietta, the immortal woman.
In 1951, doctors took a tissue sample from a poor, dying black woman that was given to researchers without her knowledge or her permission. The HeLa cells, named for the patient's first and last name, acted differently than other cells in the lab. They were hardier, and they replicated at an amazing rate. They also didn't die.
I've not heard of them either,
Cultivation of
Numoki.
HeLa
I'll check them out
launched
after
a
this.
revolution
I
in
love
biomedical
stuff like
research
this.
and a multi-billion-dollar industry. The cells were sold all over the world and led to important advances to fight humankind's deadliest diseases, including polio, HIV, and cancer. No one, aside from the patient's doctors and lead researchers, knew the origins of the HeLa cells, not her name or anything else about her life.
Is this real?
2 decades passed before this mystery woman was revealed, and it was many more years before her family had answers to their most burning questions. Today we examine the woman behind the notorious and immortal HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks.
It's real? Early life.
On August 1st, 1920, Eliza Lacks Pleasant gave birth to a baby girl, Loretta, in a shack at the end of a dead-end road in Roanoke, Virginia. At some point during her life, Loretta changed her name to Henrietta, though no one knows why. The shack, overlooking the train depot, was the young girl's home until her mother tragically died. Henrietta, at this point, was only 4 years old. Eliza passed from this life to the next during childbirth with her 10th baby, leaving her husband, Johnny, a widow. Unable to take care of all the children,
I'm sorry,
she sent them away
10th
to live with
baby?
family,
Holy shit.
125 miles southeast from Roanoke in southern Virginia. The Lacks family lived in the town of Clover, just past Difficult Creek on the banks of the River of Death. Now, this might sound
River
like a
of
bad
Death.
omen, but in the 1920s it looked like a lot of small towns in rural Virginia. On the outskirts, fields of tobacco and old plantation houses dotted the rolling hills. And on Main Street, down the dusty road, the town buzzed with life. There was a movie theatre, grocery store, post office, shops, restaurants, and a train depot. Henrietta wouldn't recognize the town today. Clover lost so many of its residents by the late 1990s that its official charter was revoked. In the last census in 2010, the population had dwindled to a mere 438. When Johnny came to town in 1924, Henrietta and her 9 brothers and sisters had to be divided up amongst the relatives. No one could take all 10 children. Henrietta ended up living with her grandfather, Tommy Lax, in a 4-roomed log cabin called the home house. Generations of Laxes had lived and died there, buried in the small family plot Henrietta could see out of her window. Formerly slave quarters,
that
the
people
home house
used to
was a
just be
simple
buried,
structure with no
like,
electricity
wherever.
or indoor plumbing, only gas lanterns and water that Henrietta hauled up from the creek below. At the home house, Henrietta awoke every morning at 4 o'clock to milk the cows and feed the pigs. When she was finished with her morning chores, she walked 2 miles to the schoolhouse for coloured children, past the white school where children threw rocks at her and called her names. Jim Crow laws segregated blacks from whites, and that remained in place until 1964. In the short 31 years of her life, it was all she knew.
Lovey-dovey woman.
Few public photos of Henrietta Lacks exist. The most well-known is a striking image from a 1970s Rolling Stone article of a smiling, smartly dressed woman in a skirt, suit jacket and open-toe sandals. Her hands are firmly placed on her hips and her walnut eyes glimmer at the camera. She looks self-assured with a hint of mischief spread about in her grin. Henrietta had no shortage of men vying for her affection as a young woman. Henrietta chose Day, her cousin, with whom she shared a bedroom and had spent countless hours with since the age of 4. They had their first baby, a boy named Lawrence, out of wedlock when Henrietta was barely 14 years old. He was born on the home house floor, like his father and numerous cousins, aunts and uncles and grandparents
Did he say
before.
cousin
Another Lacks
then?
baby, Elsie, was born 4 years later. Eventually, Henrietta and Day said their
Did she
vows
just
in a
marry her
private
cousin?
marriage ceremony on April the 10th, 1941. She was 21 and he was 25.
Did I mishear that though, Ashley?
By the winter of 1941, the country was at war, and small tobacco farms, including Henrietta and Day's, were barely making enough to make ends meet. But to the north, there was opportunity in the booming factories. Demand for steel was increasing. A great migration of black families
You heard
came
it
to Turner
correct.
Station, Maryland,
Okay.
leaving behind the southern farms. At
Weird.
Bethlehem Steel, Sparrow Point in Baltimore County, a black man could make up to 80 cents an hour, the most any of the Laxes
was
had
it just
seen.
normal
In factories, black men took the jobs white
to
men
marry
rejected,
cousins
and
back
they were
then?
exposed to a host of toxic chemicals, including asbestos. When the men finished their shifts and returned home, the toxins were shared with their wives and children through their clothes.
Fairness,
At the
Captain
urging
Nolan.
of Lax's cousin, who was doing well for himself at Sparrow Point, Day and Henrietta moved with their
In
babies
some
to Turner
states,
Station,
really?
starting a new life.
No
Other
way.
cousins made the transition too, including Henrietta's close friend Sadie. After cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the children, Henrietta and Sadie would put on their dancing shoes and sneak out until the wee hours. The two women boogied, laughed, and had a great time. And when they weren't dancing, Henrietta, Sadie, and Sadie's sister Margaret played bingo in Henrietta's living room.
love a good game
Turner
of
Station
bingo.
was new and exciting, but Henrietta preferred the country. Whenever she could, she rode the train back to Clover to work in the fields.
What's this got to do with her being immortal, though?
It was here her eldest daughter, Elsie, was most at ease. Elsie had inherited her mother's good looks, but she was born special.
She looks a spit of
unable
a
to speak
mum.
or talk.
Holy
She
hell.
made chirps and caw sounds like the birds, and sometimes flailed her arms in front of her face. Years later, it was understood that Elsie had epilepsy and cognitive developmental delays that left her unable to communicate. No one knew what
Back
was
then
going
it
on
was.
in her
Even
pretty head.
Einstein
At
married
home,
his
in
cousin.
Turner Station, Elsie
No
was known to
way.
occasionally
That
run
is
out
mad.
into the street screaming.
Every day's
By
a
the
school
time
day.
Henrietta was pregnant with her 5th baby, Elsie had grown stronger, and this made it near impossible for her mother
Yeah,
to take
5
care
minutes
of
of
her. To
talking
make
about
life
the
easier,
immortality.
doctors recommended Henrietta commit Elsie to the Crownsville State Hospital, formerly the Hospital for the Negro Insane. Believing the doctors knew best, Henrietta institutionalized her daughter. Years later, family members said, a part of Henrietta died the day she left Elsie at Crownsville. Henrietta routinely visited her daughter once a week at the hospital before she became ill. After Henrietta died, no one ever went to Crownsville to see Elsie again.
No one ever visited her?
Henrietta was certain there was something wrong with her a year and a half before her official cervical cancer diagnosis. On a referral from a local physician, Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins Hospital to seek answers. At this
Jesus,
point,
that's a bit
Henrietta thought the
fancy for a
doctors would
hospital,
simply
isn't it?
fix her right up. On January the 29th, 1951, Day drove Henrietta with their 3 small children 20 miles from Turner Station to Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins was not only a hospital, it was a renowned medical research center. It also had a public ward, serving patients who were too poor to afford treatment, many of whom were black. In the 1950s, under discriminatory segregation laws in the United States, black patients could be turned away at hospitals, doctors' offices, and clinics that served white patients. Sometimes the consequences were dire, including death. Johns Hopkins was Henrietta's best and only real option for diagnosis and treatment of cervical cancer. While they sat in the car with their small children, waiting for Henrietta to return, she met Dr. Howard Jones, the gynecologist on duty. In the exam room, he reviewed her medical history and listened to Henrietta describe the lump that she felt inside her. When Jones examined her, he found a hard mass about the size of a nickel. The tumour was the colour of grape jello, exactly in the spot Henrietta said it would be. Decades later, in his 90s, Jones recalled never seeing anything like Henrietta's tumour during his years practicing medicine, not before and not since. During the exam, Dr. Jones cut a tiny sample of the tumour to test and confirm what he suspected was cancerous. Jones thought it was odd that Henrietta had had a full-term baby just a few months prior, with no notes mentioning the tumour or any abnormalities of the cervix listed in her chart. It was unlikely physicians would have missed seeing it, which
they
meant
don't
it
care.
must have grown at an alarming rate. A few days later,
It sounded like they just didn't care though, right?
Epidermoid carcinoma.
She was trying to tell them.
Stage 1.
So this gyno was like, whoa, I've never seen anything like this before. Taking a cut of that.
In
Thank you very
1951,
much.
it was standard practice to conduct research on public ward hospital patients without consent. Explicit permission or informed consent from patients wasn't a term that was coined, and so no legal or ethical standard existed in the United States for obtaining it. At Hopkins, the then leading cervical cancer expert in the world, and Dr. Jones's boss, Richard Tallind, believed that since the patients were treated free of charge, the research was a form of payment for the hospital's services. When Henrietta went in for her exam, a sample from Henrietta's tumour was sent to George Gay's lab, the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins, without her knowledge. For years, Gay had been trying unsuccessfully to grow and keep alive human cells outside of the body in petri dishes. Culturing cells allowed scientists to test their response to all kinds of drugs, diseases, and conditions in order to understand how the human body would react. The benefit of this was that it didn't cause any harm to the patients. When Henrietta went to Hopkins, an agreement was already in place to provide Gay's research lab with patients' cancerous tumour samples, primarily to be used in studies to prove Tallind's theories. Tallind was a believer that of the two types of cervical cancer, the non-invasive variety, carcinoma in situ, could spread and become deadly. This was contrary to what the majority of researchers thought at the time, and physicians' practices followed this conclusion, treating only the invasive cancers aggressively. He actually had another motive for his research using cells too. Tallind wanted to reduce the number of unjustifiable hysterectomies by detecting what wasn't cervical cancer at all. The Pap smear test used to identify changes to a woman's cervical cells was developed only a decade earlier, but few physicians could interpret the results and treat patients accordingly. In extreme cases, a woman who just needed a few antibiotics to clear up a minor infection might have had her entire uterus removed in a surgical procedure. When Gay's lab assistant Mary received Henrietta's tissue sample, she had every reason to believe the cells, if they lived at all, would die within a few days. So far, even with Gay's standards, meticulous process, and emphasis on sterilization, his lab had little success with growing human cells. When Mary got to work on Henrietta's cancer cells, she carefully and precisely sliced the samples with steady hands, mixed the media the cells would need to grow, and labeled them HeLa for the first two letters of Henrietta's first and last names. Then she left them alone, not really expecting very much. By the next morning, to Mary's surprise, Henrietta's cells had divided, and in the days ahead, HeLa kept making copies of themselves. They grew unlike any cells before and expanded into as much space as Mary would give them. Gay was ecstatic because the cells were growing like crabgrass, and soon, among researchers, word was out about the amazing HeLa cells. Everyone knew the implications for furthering biomedical research.
Yeah, so is her daughter the same then?
Soon he began sending HeLa cells to any scientist interested in using them for their own studies.
Like, is it going to be genetic thing?
Henrietta's treatment for cervical cancer was radium, a radioactive metal that glows blue and is highly toxic. Now, radium does kill cancer cells, but it can burn skin from a person's body if it's given in high enough quantities.
Terrifying.
Being radioactive,
Absolutely
radium,
terrifying.
it also causes cancer. In 1951, the radium treatment for cervical cancer involved placing tubes inside the patient next to the affected area. Common side effects included nausea, vomiting, weakness, and anemia. If Henrietta experienced any of these, she didn't let on or seem sick at all. After treatment started, Henrietta finally told the same cousins she confided in about the knot inside her. She didn't want anyone to worry, but the frequent visits to Johns Hopkins would mean she would be away, and people would certainly wonder. Initially, the radium treatment seemed to work, and doctors recorded the tumour as having vanished. As therapy progressed, Henrietta didn't feel any better, and to her horror, her abdomen turned from soft brown to black as coal. One day she lifted up her shirt and showed Sadie and Margaret, and said it felt as though the blackness be spreading all inside. The radium treatments didn't cure Henrietta's cancer. By the fall of 1951, her body was full of tumours in her diaphragm, her bladder, cervix, kidneys, lungs, and it was all causing her excruciating pain. She lay in bed at Johns Hopkins and screamed out like it was the devil of pain itself. Between the treatments and the cancer, Henrietta was weak and her kidneys were no longer flushing out dangerous toxins in her blood. She had to receive numerous transfusions. The doctors tried different medications to ease her suffering, including morphine,
so she had
which didn't even touch the pain. On one desperate attempt, the doctors even injected alcohol into her spine, but nothing seemed to work. All anyone could do was sit beside her bed and pray.
Well, her cells were like
Gladys
reproducing,
was at her bedside
right?
the night she succumbed to cancer. Knowing her time had come, Henrietta made her sister promise to take care of her kids and whispered through tears, "Don't you let anything bad happen to them children when I'm gone." At 12:15 a.m. on October the 4th,
really good at these videos. He does
Henrietta
extensive
Lacks took
research
her last
and
breath
yeah,
and
you can
died
tell
in
that
her
he's
hospital
passionate
bed.
about it.
Her body was sent back to Clover and buried in the family plot in an unmarked grave next to her mother. The importance of Henrietta's cells cannot be overstated. Through this immortalized, continuously cultured cell line, cancer research has advanced, vaccines have been developed, gene mapping has taken place, and treatments of various diseases have been studied and undertaken. HeLa cells have even been put into space on missions with both Americans and Russians, were tested against an atomic bomb, and were the first human cells to be cloned. Perhaps the most well-known advances using HeLa cells occurred shortly after Henrietta's death in the midst of a polio epidemic. The virus was sweeping the country, and parents feared for the lives of their children. In late summer, dubbed polio season, public swimming pools were shut down, and officials warned the virus could be spread by sitting too close to others at movie theatres. By 1952, 60,000 children were infected, and thousands were paralyzed. A vaccine was in development by Jonas Salk, but he needed a way to test it in a lab on a grand scale before injecting children. HeLa provided the perfect opportunity. Soon, the HeLa project at Tuskegee University began growing the cell line, employing mostly black women lab technicians. Tuskegee's mass production of HeLa would serve as the first of its kind, and it helped launch a multi-billion-dollar industry when the first commercial cell culture operation began using Tuskegee's model.
Did we find out why her cells were so different, though? Do we ever find that out?
While this groundbreaking biomedical research was taking place, only a handful of people could trace the HeLa cell line origins back to a poor 31-year-old black woman with cervical cancer. 2 decades would pass before the name Henrietta Lacks was finally released to the public.
Like, why her? Why were her cells so different to
how
others,
Henrietta's cells were used to advance medical research. Indeed, when her name was released to the public, many questions were still left unanswered. The children, especially her daughter Deborah, were too young to remember her mother and longed to know what she was like.
Again, would her daughter have the same cells?
She breastfed her. Not knowing and not understanding how her mother's cells could still be living after her death was terrifying and caused the family great anxiety and pain. Her sons and husband Day were mostly angry with Johns Hopkins, the doctors, and George Gay.
Well, yeah,
Day
they
never
stole
gave the hospital
them.
permission to use his wife's cells, and it didn't seem right or fair that people were making millions of dollars from selling them while members of the family
Can't
couldn't even
blame you,
afford
lad, for
health
being
insurance.
annoyed at that,
Hopkins
to be
has made
honest.
public statements that the hospital has never directly profited from HeLa, and at the time no federal regulations were in place for obtaining permission to use Henrietta's cells for research. For now, over 60 years after her death, Henrietta's cells live on and continue to provide us with immeasurable value in the fight to cure and eradicate disease. For that, we can be grateful, and now we know a little bit more about the woman Henrietta Lacks.
You'd think they would want to investigate the family a bit more as well, and again, like her history, and if what happened to her could then happen to her children as well. You know what I mean? Mad, absolute Madness. Right. Enjoyed that. And then Nando had a Mondana walking ghost.
Hisashi Aochi was married, had a young son, he smoked a pack of cigarettes a day, he played rugby in high school, and by 1999 he was employed as a technician at the JCO Tokimura power plant. He and his colleagues had been tasked with creating the fuel for a fast reactor called Joyo. And so as Aochi and his colleague are creating this mixture, a very dangerous event occurred known as criticality. One of the survivors, who was sitting away from the tank behind a desk, described this event as being an extremely loud bang followed by this blue flash that filled the entire room. And what that blue light was extremely high levels of radiation. And because Aochi was the one kind of leaning over the tank, it all went right through him.
Pavoni, thank you so much for your follow. Welcome to this rich channel. I hope you enjoy it, and hope your day has been going well as well.
He does not have any physical wounds. This was not an explosion, so there's no lacerations or anything on his body. But he had been exposed to 17 sieverts of radiation, which is the highest amount of radiation any human being has ever been exposed to in documented history. Aochi was airlifted to a hospital, and doctors and nurses were actually kind of amazed at how well he was doing in those first few days. Again, he did not have any burn marks or anything on his body.
Not feeling this one at the minute, I'll be honest.
On his right arm, which was positioned directly over the tank when this criticality event occurred, but he was in good spirits and was even joking around with the staff about how he can't wait to get home. In reality, Aochi died as soon as he was exposed to that criticality event and received 17 sieverts of radiation. He was in what's known as walking ghost phase, where due to high levels of radiation, all of his chromosomes had been obliterated, which meant his body did not have a blueprint to reproduce cells. So basically, he appeared alive and well because his body had created all of these cells in his body before the accident. But as those cells died off, they would not be reproduced, which means in walking ghost phase, your body is turning into a corpse, but you're alive to watch it happen.
That's
Tragically,
mad.
after doctors discovered this about his condition and they informed Aochi of what was going on, Aochi did not seem to think there could be that serious of consequences for being exposed to that level of radiation. 3 weeks after the accident, his intestines began to hemorrhage and his skin fell off. All of it. They attempted numerous skin grafts to try to keep his bodily fluids inside of him, but none of them took. So
I think that's it for me. I think that's it. I honestly, yeah, things like that blow my mind. They really do. I am more into like the true crime stuff though, I think. I think what I struggle with at times is if they hammer you with so much information, I get a little bit overwhelmed. It's not so bad if they break it up with like visuals so I can sort of follow along with it as best I can.